All right, welcome back. This is part two of our discussion about Joseph the Seer in the context of the 19th century magical worldview culture and the activities of Joseph, looking at a little bit more complex background that considers the possibility that some of his activities are similar to activities that we've seen employed in various con artists and fraudulent schemes. We've had researcher Christopher C. Smith and historian Dan Vogel discussing the early activities of Joseph Smith. We painted a picture where we have a culture in the New York, New England area that's steeped in this tradition of folk magic and folklore, and how a lot of those different characteristics were an integral and essential part of Joseph Smith's family's activities in the area. We've seen Joseph start to build a reputation as somebody who could be employed as a seer, and how that's kind of gotten him into some trouble with the law as he was involved in a trial in 1826. And we've gotten to the point where he's now had several years of this story of buried ancient records of a spirit, a guardian spirit who we learn later is the angel Moroni, who's told him where the location. And at the end of our discussion, we got the introduction of these spectacles that, in addition to the golden plates, we've got spectacles that we learn later are given the name of Urim and Thummim. And he's been back to the site over, he tells the story that he's been back to the site over a number of years, and ultimately with Emma in tow, is able to finally be given permission to give the plates. So where do we go from here? The stone has been an integral part of all of these activities. And when we say that he's been employed as a seer or a scryer for treasure hunting, what he's been doing is he's been accompanying diggers and other people. He's had his face in the hat, and he's told people where to dig. He's told them about spirits that he's seen around these treasures. So those are the activities that the stone that we recently have pictures of were involved in. How does this stone play in the picture that is starting to unfold now that Joseph has the plates, or is telling the story that he has the plates? You want to start us out, Chris?
Sure. So, first of all, let me say that when Joseph marries Emma, Isaac Hale is very unhappy with this. They essentially elope, and Isaac Hale is her father. And Isaac Hale confronts Joseph about money digging, his involvement in money digging. And Joseph basically says that money digging, he's never been able to actually see anything in the stone. Alva Hale says that Joseph Smith said peeping was all damn nonsense, which is probably an exaggeration. But Joseph seems to have admitted that he couldn't really see things in the stone, and said that he would move to Pennsylvania and work hard for a living and go into farming.
Now, this is interesting because I think it was Dan mentioned that Isaac Hale was part of an earlier treasure digging endeavor that the Smiths were involved in. Is that true?
Right, and the Lewis affidavit says that, or the Lewis letters say that that Hales were believers for a little while, but then stopped being believers.
Okay, so what year is it that Joseph marries Emma?
1828, or no, 1827.
Okay, so this is after the trial now. Does he marry Emma?
January.
It's January?
I believe it's January 18th. I'm not sure. January 1827.
Okay, so we're definitely after the trial. I'm getting a little bit of echo from one of the things. You might try fixing that. Okay, so it's after the trial. Is the elopement before or after the retrieval of the gold plates?
Before.
Before.
Okay, so
Emma's going to be there. After they get married, they can't go back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, so they move in with the Smiths in Manchester, and they're there from January to September, 1827. And September, what happens is that, according to Lucy Smith's account, Joseph Smith comes home one day after they sent him on an errand to Manchester, comes home late at night and says, "I've received the severest chastisement in my life." And they inquire as to what it was, and Joseph says, "It was the messenger. I was walking back from Manchester past the hill, and the messenger met me and chastised me for not being after the work of getting the plates, and that I'm supposed to get the plates. So that's why I argue that it's a surprise to everybody that Joseph Smith's going to get these plates eventually. They had forgotten about it for a while.
So I kind of get the sense when I retrospectively look back at it, it's kind of like after the trial of 1826, the heat is on in terms of scrying activities, and that he then diverts his energies towards this other narrative that he had abandoned previously.
Right.
He begins to make the story more of a religious story at this point. This is where the treasure lore starts to
It's always
fade.
had religious elements from the beginning.
Right.
It's not that it was an angel, but that the book had religious content.
Okay.
Right. Although there's also, within the Book of Mormon itself, there's indication that like the Book of Lehi was a more historical part, and that the small plates, as he transitions, it's a more religious part. And then you get like Joseph Smith Sr. talking about the plates having Masonic symbols and things on the plates, and then the Masonic stuff. By the time Joseph Smith actually translates the Book of Mormon, it's an anti-Masonic book. So I think that you see, even this late in the story, you're seeing Joseph Smith phasing out treasure lore aspects of the story and moving to a much more religious kind of narrative.
Okay.
He promised Isaac Hale that he would give up money digging, and when they saw him translating the plates in the same manner that he dug for money, they thought it was the same thing but a different version. In Joseph's mind, it was different, but in their minds, it wasn't.
So from his retrieval of the plates, how long does it take before he's engaged in the work of translating, or at least putting forth that he's translating?
Well, he was translating in I think it was April through June 1828. Is that right, Dan? Maybe May through June 1828.
Well,
That's when he translates the Book of Lehi.
So he gets the plates in 1827 September, but he can't really do much about translating because of his old money digging friends thought that they had access to the plates as well because they were in a company. They had actually been digging on the Hill Cumorah in 1825 after Joseph Smith showed Samuel Lawrence where the plates were, and Samuel Lawrence saw the spectacles. So that so they started digging on the Hill Cumorah on the eastern slope, and then later Joseph said that he had showed Lawrence the wrong location, and that it was, and through Oliver Cowdery we learned that the supposed location where the plates were buried was near the top on the western side of the hill. So and right after that, Lorenzo Saunders says they walked up and down the hill looking for the spot, and they could not find any fresh digging except for the place that had been dug before. And so at any rate, they couldn't do any translating much of anything because of the money diggers. They were trying to get the plates continually from Joseph Smith. So they decided to change the location and go to Harmony. And Isaac Hale had promised to get them started on a farm. And they arrived there, 1820, and it was probably December of 1828. And Joseph Smith started copying characters from the plates from that time to about February. That's when Martin Harris shows up, gets the characters, and takes them to Professor Anthon down at Columbia University, and then returns. And shortly after that, Martin Harris begins as the permanent scribe. Before that, Emma was probably the scribe for the earliest pages while Harris was gone. Then Harris took over.
This actually is a good point to look at where the stone plays a role in all of this. So you mentioned that they moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania before any of the translation activities could begin in earnest because of the other people interested in the gold plates. The earliest accounts that we have, if you listen to the recent discussion that D. Michael Quinn is involved in, there was some confusion as to he made the case that he didn't believe that the twin translators or directors were ever employed, either in the 116 pages or thereafter. Are we given to understand that it was this stone that we're seeing pictures of now that were involved from the very beginning with Emma, or was there something different?
I believe that Joseph used the spectacles at least briefly, and because Charles Anthon, in his 1834 letter, when he describes what Martin Harris said to him when Harris came out and visited him, according to Anthon, the plates were concealed in a chest underneath the hearth, and Martin Harris was sitting on the opposite side of a curtain from Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith used the spectacles to remotely view the characters on the plates, and then transcribe some of the characters and handed the Anthon transcript through the curtain to Martin Harris on the other side. So Joseph Smith, at the very least, seems to have used the spectacles to actually transcribe the characters that are on the Anthon transcript.
Okay, so you just blew my mind. I was always under the impression that the spectacles, when they were employed for the first 116 pages, were actually with the plates, and it was only thereafter with the peepstone that the plates were not there. But what you're saying is, according to the account that Harris gave to Anthon, even with the spectacles, the plates were not actually directly in front of Joseph when he was dictating. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And Harris described
the
spectacles being placed in a hat, much like the stone was placed in a hat, although Harris wasn't within sight range of that, so because Joseph was behind a curtain. So if Harris is reporting how Joseph used the spectacles, he's reporting based on what Joseph told him. And because the spectacles were 8 inches long, there's some question, I think, about whether they would actually fit in the hat, and that's where you get a couple accounts that say that Joseph may have actually removed the stones from the silver bow that they were placed in. The spectacles, by the way, were 2 very large, 2-inch thick, 2-inch in diameter white stones placed in a silver bow. And so there's a couple accounts that should suggest that Joseph removed the stones from the bow and placed the stones in the hat. But I think that that's just sort of a invented story to make this story about the spectacles going in the hat work, given the size of the spectacles.
Okay, but the mechanics would have been the same in terms of him pressing his face around the hat?
Yeah.
Okay. Were you going to say something, Dan?
Okay, so the only accounts we have that mentions a curtain or a blanket come from Professor Anthon in 1834 and other letters, and John A. Clark, minister in Palmyra. Now, when Martin Harris talked to Professor Anthon, all he had seen is basically the copying of the characters, and Joe Smith would have done that by taking the plates behind the curtain and copying them, and maybe translating a few, practice things about that time. So the translation hadn't begun in earnest, and so those are the only 2 people that mention the blanket is before the translation had even really started. And Martin Harris was the scribe for the 116 pages, and Emma Smith was scribe for the lost 116 pages. And both of them, when they describe the translation process, speak of the dark colored stone being put into the hat. So there's no, some people get the impression that the spectacles were used up until the loss of the 116 pages, and then they were taken away because of that mistake, and the stone had to be used after that. That comes from the statement that Emma and sometimes David Whitmer make, is that the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim, were only used were not used after that because they were taken away. They're not saying that it was used really up until then.
I see.
Some accounts make it sound like they're saying that because maybe they misunderstood, or maybe they just had a dividing line, a mental dividing line like that in their minds years later.
Okay.
But whenever Emma was described for the last 116 pages, because she's the one that mentions that Joseph was surprised that in the early translating phase, that Jerusalem had walls. And
Okay, so now you're bringing up some good things that tie back into what we discussed before, where there was this tradition with people that would come and do frauds. They would do proof tests that would be intended to demonstrate their power to the people whose belief they really relied on. So you mentioned that there's this interaction that Joseph has with Emma as she is translating for him, that she relates to somebody later as kind of evidence of the fact that Joseph was receiving unique information from his exercise of these powers as seer. Tell us a little bit about that event.
well, so the witnesses always want to make this impression that they weren't fools for believing Joseph Smith. Some people say, "Oh, he's just memorized things and he's speaking them," and they want to make sure people believe that they were careful, maybe a little skeptical, or they had really good reason to believe that Joseph Smith had this gift. And one of them, Emma gives, is that he would start and stop. After breaks, right where he left off. He would correct spellings, of proper names, correct the spelling, and or he was surprised once when he read that in the translation that there were walls around Jerusalem, and he asked Emma, "Are there walls around Jerusalem, or am I being deceived?" And that was proof to Emma that Joseph Smith hardly knew the Bible, and which isn't true. Joseph Smith knew the Bible pretty well, and so some of their downfall is that they think that they are quite clever. Like Martin Harris thinks he's pretty clever and he can't be fooled. And anybody can be fooled. Even magicians can be fooled, and magicians fool other magicians all the time. I mean, so. You have to be careful in thinking that I could never be fooled. And
there's this show that Penn and Teller have where they invite magicians to come and try to fool them, and Penn and Teller sit there and they try to figure out how is he deceiving us, because they start with the skeptic position that there's a deception. Obviously, nobody has these magical powers, and as I was thinking about this question, I imagine Penn and Teller sitting there looking at Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith saying, "Okay, well, you can't see these plates. There's going to be a blanket divider," and they would be like, "Of course, you're making sure that nobody can see these things. That's how you can claim the things that you have." And it seems like an obvious deception to outsiders. It's only when you have people that are that presubscribe to his abilities that difficulty is.
The whole thing about the spectacles is that they're not Joseph's idea. Okay, they're Lawrence's idea. So he gets them only because he wants to preserve Lawrence's testimony that the plates were in the hill. So he has Lawrence's testimony, the plates are in the hill, and he has to get the spectacles because Lawrence has seen them and everybody believes that. And he gets them, and he may have allowed Lucy Smith to fill them through a handkerchief, but he discards them as fast as he can. And
interesting.
It wouldn't be very convincing if he sat behind a curtain dictating. Anybody would just say, well, he's just reading some sort of text. And Joseph Smith isn't using a text. So he might as well get the full effect of his ability by doing it in front of people and having many witnesses say he put his head in the hat, he dictated, and that's proof that no one could do that. Well, Joseph Smith, they can't do that, but Joseph Smith can do that. That's the whole deal. Joseph Smith can do that. And everybody else says, oh, I couldn't do that. Well, yeah, you can't do that because you don't have Joseph Smith's gift. So he gets the full effect, and he gets witnesses to that The only problem with that is that the magical, folk magic origins of all of that become an embarrassment, and he can't really use it anymore if he wants to convert many traditional Orthodox Christians out there.
So we're going
And
to get to that point where we start to see the effect of Signy Rigdon and some of these other conversions of religiousness away from the folk magic character of it. Chris, Dan spoke a little bit about one of these proof events with Emma in terms of the walls of Jerusalem, and we're starting to see a new character now, Martin Harris, who is involved in the translation process. What reason did Martin Harris have to believe that Joseph Smith had these powers?
Yeah, so Martin Harris is interesting because apparently when Joseph Smith meets him, he says something along the lines of, I have a promise from God that the first honest man that I meet will give me $50 to help with the translation of the Book of Mormon, and Martin Harris turns over the money. So I think Joseph Smith is sort of feeling Martin Harris out from the beginning as sort of a potential mark for this scheme. And Martin Harris...
That's a genius move because it speaks to the guy's own integrity. He's like, well, I'm honest. Well, if I give you $50, then it validates, what God said about me.
Yeah, and Joseph Smith was a great reader of people. I mean, he really knew how to kind of detect sort of what people wanted to hear, and Joseph would mirror those things back to the people. And Martin Harris was a very religious, very superstitious man. He's known for sort of having wild visions and kind of making grandiose statements about his own sort of spiritual importance. So I think that Martin really wanted to believe that this was an important spiritual thing that was happening. And also Martin was an investor. Joseph portrayed this as a way that Martin could make a lot of money. And when Martin's wife challenges him about whether the Book of Mormon is true, Martin reportedly said that, well, maybe it is a lie, but if you leave me alone, I'll make money at it. And so he has this interesting combination of religious and spiritual motives. Now, when Joseph switches from the spectacles to the stone, according to Martin, Joseph did this for convenience. And there are also other people who report that Joseph said that he could translate as well with the stone as with the spectacles. Now, in later Mormon lore, of course, the spectacles are supposed to be the Urim and Thummim, they're supposed to be the Jaredite interpreters, they're supposed to be this special religious artifact. But at the time, Joseph is viewing these as essentially the spectacles and the stone are both interchangeable magical artifacts, and he describes both of them as keys, and he says that the hills of New York are full of such keys. And so he's really viewing them as interchangeable.
Is that a borrowed Masonic term? You hear about keys in Masonry. Was there another context that those show up?
I haven't really found other people describing seer-stones as keys. This seems to be sort of a Joseph Smith invention, but he does, of course, later transition to a much more intangible use of keys, right? At this point, keys are physical artifacts, but later the keys become intangible things. But anyway, so Martin describes Joseph using the seer-stone, and one of the things that Joseph does to sort of, or that Martin does to test Joseph, is they go down to the river, and Martin finds a stone that looks very much like Joseph Smith's chocolate egg-shaped seer-stone, and so when Joseph isn't looking, he replaces Joseph's stone in the hat with this other stone that he's found by the river. And Joseph looks into the hat, and there's silence for a moment, and then he says, "Martin, what's going on? It's as dark as Egypt in here." And Martin just can't hold it in. His expression betrays him, and he reveals that he has swapped out the stone. And this to Martin is really impressive. It shows that, in fact, there was something special about Joseph's seer-stone.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that are remarkable when you actually see the stone as we see it now. Before the pictures of the stone, you say, okay, well, he changed it out with another stone that looked similar. But I would be very surprised if any random stone in a brook could look as remarkable as this stone looks, because it's a very captivating stone to look at.
Joseph would not have mistaken whatever stone Martin found for his real seer stone.
Yeah, but it did provide him an opportunity to prove to
That's
his
how the whole
mark.
thing works too, is taking advantage of certain opportunities. Um, so
What
it
about
does
the pin?
show.
There's another story with a pin
That's
that
that's
Martin
that's
had.
what I believe is one of the opportunities that Joseph did see where it fell. Martin didn't, and so he just used that opportunity to find it, to whip out his stone and pretend like he found it with the stone. And the thing is that constantly, and just like psychics fail sometimes, Joseph Smith probably failed a lot of the time, and those stories are forgotten. That's
Yeah.
what humans do, is that they forget. Like when you look at a cold reading where the psychic doesn't know the mark, they'll use generalities and then hone in. And if you like do an experiment and tape a psychic reading, like on TV, if you see them, and you play it back and you count how many times they were wrong, and then they were right. Everybody forgets all those wrong guesses and they focus on the right one. So it's selective validation.
And we,
They're
we're probably seeing
selectively
that happen
validating.
as we look back on history, where it's only the stories that confirm what everyone wants to believe about Joseph that are then retold and part of the historical record. And then you get few
It's
things
like,
that slip in, like the Greek Psalter, where there was a failure, and those kind of just
right.
don't get paid attention to.
So we do it all the time. I mean, as people that like to watch their dreams, pay attention to their dreams, they'll forget all the dreams that are nonsense, and or ones that had some sort of thing about a concern about someone, some other person, and then we'll forget about those because nothing happened. But if it happens to coincide with something that does happen, or we can interpret it that it did, then we'll remember those dreams. Forget
Yeah.
about all the ones that weren't fulfilled. So humans do that on a regular basis, looking for meaning. We're like meaning machines.
Yeah.
And and um, so the thing
But
with
we're
Martin
learning that
Harris was
that's
an
a big part of the
opportunity.
tradition. Hmm.
It was an opportunity that presented itself, I believe, and he took advantage of it, and it was remembered as evidence. But
So Martin devised his own test for Joseph, and his
uh,
wife devised her own test for Joseph. Her test was a little bit more empirical, perhaps a little bit more cutting to the issue. What did Martin's wife do famously?
you're not talking about the last 116 pages, are you?
I am, I believe, because that was a form of a
Oh,
test too, was it not?
well, Joseph took it as a test. I don't know if I believe she just took it and burned it because her only concern was stopping her husband's interest in this project and in the
Okay.
possibility of losing money. Um, but Joseph could never be sure that the manuscript was destroyed, and so he was afraid to redo the beginning. Um, but he delayed doing the beginning until the beginning uh, was up until the Book of Mosiah, and included the beginning of the Book of Mosiah is missing. There's no superscription at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah, and it begins abruptly. So whatever, Joseph Smith, I imagine, handed Martin Harris a signature or two and said, "Here, a bundle of folded pages. Here, take this," and he kept the one that continued. So he continued from Mosiah to the end, and then he waited until the last moment to make sure he wasn't ever going to get him, and then he went back to the beginning and then supplied the beginning.
Okay. But
Um,
you're referring to the fact that what we have as the Book of Mormon now was not actually dictated in the order that it's presented in the book
right,
now.
right.
Okay.
So he gave it the replacement text was a different record that happened to cover the same period of time, so he didn't have to worry about wording or some of the name list of kings that he had given. He couldn't do that again. So the point to make is that in the first edition, he wrote a preface. In the preface, he complained about certain parties keeping the lost manuscript from him. And now you want to ask yourself, well, if you have this great stone and you could find anything with it and translate it, why don't you just whip that out and find the lost manuscript?
Yes, yes.
So, but he didn't do that, because this is the thing: the psychic wins when they're in control.
Yeah.
They have to be in control of the narrative. When they're not in control, they cannot operate. It doesn't work. So whenever you want to test a psychic, take control. And this is where, one of the famous stories is Uri Geller appeared on
Johnny Carson's show.
Johnny Carson's
It's a great
show.
story.
And Johnny Carson calls up the Amazing Randy, and the Amazing Randy says, supply your own stuff, containers and whatever, coins and your own forks, spoons to bend. Supply them and make them do them with those. Well, it turned out that Uri Geller couldn't operate. He couldn't do anything. And he came up with his own ad hoc theory of why he couldn't do it. And that was, you are a skeptic. And the skeptics give off bad vibes, and it doesn't work. Things don't work.
When you watch that event taking place live, he starts out by saying, I'm tired, and it just doesn't feel right. And when you watch the documentary of Honest Liar, where Randy tells his side of this story, he kind of had them. He figured out how Uri was detecting which of the containers had water in it, and he had them kind of glue the containers down so they wouldn't move in a special way that would let him know which one he was going to detect. And when I saw that that Mr. Geller complained of being tired or exhausted, so his power didn't work, it just reminded me exactly of some of the excuses that were given when a treasure was not found, when they were treasure hunting, because you have the exact same pattern of, I'm tired, my gift is tired, or something like that. Regarding the story,
my eyes are sore. My eyes are sore. The enchantment's too strong.
Exactly. You didn't sacrifice the animal just the right way.
You messed up. You didn't say the right words in the right order.
On the issue of the 116 pages, I know the story that I was raised with was that he couldn't retranslate those pages because then they would change the original document and would compare it with what he translated, and it wouldn't match up, and they knew this. And I think this is related in the Doctrine and Covenants section that talks about this. And
Yes.
I came across this account where...
DNC 10.
Yes, exactly, where Joseph Smith actually did translate a scripture twice. When he was doing his inspired translation, he dictated up, including the book Matthew chapter 26 in one book. Then he took a break, changed scribes, and they didn't realize that he had finished chapter 26, and so he redictated chapter 26 in a different folio. And it was only going back hundreds of years later that the researchers found out that we have the same chapter given an inspired translation twice, and they are materially different from each other. Now, that did not immediately discredit Joseph Smith in the mind of everyone, so maybe the fears about the 116 pages were a little bit overblown, but there's actually an article, if you do a search for the twice translated scripture on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff blog, it actually gives you all the citation for that.
Now, the thing I would say about the lost 116 pages, immediately occurs that if anybody had altered a handwritten text, you'd be able to tell what was altered, and
exactly
that it wasn't in the handwriting of these certain scribes, and it wouldn't fool anyone. So the excuse is kind of lame.
I agree. It's odd, though, how it gains more credibility as time goes on, because we live in an environment where you could, Photoshop or otherwise things, and so we almost add more credibility because of our presentism when we look back on that.
Chris?
But I was just going to say it's an extremely lame excuse, and there's a reason that this is the story that the South Park guys zeroed in on when they did their Mormon episode, because it's a huge red flag. It's a huge red flag.
Yeah. So it also implies that he could have retranslated exactly the same if it weren't for that.
That's true.
So
Um,
there's the mechanical translation that a lot of the apologists are trying to get out of in order to explain the anachronistic use of New Testament passages is in the Old Testament portion of the Book of Mormon, or the whatever. They
well,
want to go to some very loose translation, and that's not Joseph Smith's story. Joseph Smith's story was that he was a seer. He saw the translation. He didn't divine it in his mind. The whole idea was that the seer-stone was a seer-stone, and that he would look on it and see the translation, and it wasn't his. It was God's translation.
So tell us about those accounts, because you're talking about the specific mechanics, what we understand about how Joseph used this stone to come about with the text of the Book of Mormon. Where do those accounts come from, and what are they specifically?
What part? Of
How he
inputting
actually used the stone, yeah, exactly, for the purpose of translation.
Oh, okay, so on the one of the recent interviews, one of the historians involved tried to do the conceptual translation theory that the B.H. Roberts is so famous for inventing, and he tried to explain that B.H. Roberts tried to explain that the concepts would flow into Joseph Smith's mind, and he would express those concepts in the best language he could command. And so that would excuse bad grammar and all sorts of things,
Certainly.
and that you would then be free to make corrections maybe later. A lot of the times, first, David Whitmer and Martin Harris specifically talk about that Joseph Smith told them. It's not a speculation on their part. Joseph Smith told them that when he looked in the stone, he saw something that resembled parchment. On the parchment would be written the characters, and underneath the translation, sort of, like one of those Bibles that has an interlinear translation. And so it was very exacting as to this is a direct translation. And Joseph used the term, the title page of the Book of Mormon is a literal translation from the very last leaf on the plates.
So it specifically says literal translation, because I've
yes,
heard
literal translation.
Us in the 20th century, or translation means something different from what translation meant back then. The word translation.
Yeah.
They'll usually cite Webster's dictionary or something like that.
Of course, when Joseph Smith's doing the Book of Mormon, no one knows about the inspired version, his own revelations later, the Book of Abraham, or any thing that Joseph Smith might do later might be influenced by his own true knowledge of learning Hebrew later. So
Right.
You can't really try to blend it all together and try to explain, this is the Book of Mormon. Now, so it's not a speculation on David Whitmer's part about what's happening, like this historians, these people couldn't see in Joseph Smith's mind. Of course not. This is the story he told them. This is why they believed what they believed. They didn't make it up and all make it up the same, being years. All these descriptions are given like years later when none of them have any contact with each other or anything. So the second method they try to bring the conceptual translation in the story with is DNC 9. DNC 9 is where Oliver Cowdery is trying to his own hand at translating, and he fails. Okay, and DNC 9 is given to explain the failure, and it says that you can't translate because you didn't understand that you're supposed to work it out in your mind, and after you work it out in your mind, you're supposed to ask if it's right, and if it is right, I will cause a burning to happen in your bosom, and if it's wrong, you shall have a stupor thought, and you shall forget the thing that is wrong. Therefore, you cannot write anything that is sacred, save it be given you from God. So, this though has a larger context. There's actually two other revelations that lead up to this one, and the first revelation is where Joe Smith supposedly reads Oliver Cowdery's thoughts and mentions that he had prayed to God to ask if these things are true. Like, you know, Joe Smith couldn't figure that out on his own. But so the revelation says, remember I told you in your mind and your heart that these things were true. Well, that's the same, you know, way that he's going to you translate the Book of Mormon. It says, and you have a gift of God, and that with the rod. Well, that's what it says. The rod, the Aaron's rod, in the present edition of D&C 8, and that rod in the earlier version talks about the rod. The rod of Aaron is a rod of nature, or it uses bud in the earliest manuscript, like Aaron's rod budded. You know, so Oliver Cowdery is a rod worker. He got this gift from his father, William Cowdery. William Cowdery was involved with a rod working, the rod workers of Wells, Vermont, and so Cowdery evidently has this rod, and Joe Smith verifies that it works, and
so what you're talking about
it
is
means it's
another
getting revelation.
injection. What you're talking about is another injection of folk magic tradition being tied in with the origin of Mormonism, in that you have this dowsing rod that is being validated by it actually being referred to as a spiritual gift in the voice of the Lord, describing it to Oliver. And we saw, I think Chris wanted to make some comment about how the words that are being used to describe these things get changed later to sort of take away their folk magic origin and imbue it with a religious Judeo-Christian theme to it. And we see that happen here as well as in other elements. When you talk about
so I wanted to see how the rod works.
Yeah, exactly. So how, I mean,
today
you look at a stone and you see words. That's very tangible. You can get very direct things. How does a rod work for getting that type of spiritual revelation?
Well, much like
working out in your mind.
Well, do you want to say? You want to describe this, Chris?
When you scratch your head with the rod?
Well, no, I mean, the rod is going to give you a yes or no answer. If it's a yes, it's going to dip. You hold it in your hands, and then you ask it a question, and if the answer is yes, you're going to feel the rod kind of go like this. And so it's a little bit like a Ouija board, you know, where sort of there's some maybe subconscious, you're answering your own questions going on. But basically, what Dan is getting at is that whole thing about working it out in your mind first and then asking the Lord whether it's right, that's not talking about a seer-stone translation. It's talking about a translation with a divining rod. And so Oliver's process would have been different from Joseph's process.
I see. And that's actually the process that we as Mormons have been kind of given to determine the truth of things in our own personal lives. I know that's how it was described to me.
I believe that it is a description of how Joseph received revelation and received the Book of Mormon. It happens not to have anything to do with the seer-stone, because Joseph didn't need the seer-stone to dictate. He used that process of asking God, just like any writer who would, write a book, and you feel good about what you have just written, or you don't. You either, oh, that's good, and you keep it, or you say, ah, that's awful, and you erase it, and then you carry on. So, so Joseph did do that, I believe, but that is not how the stone worked. The stone doesn't work that way, and so D&C 9 is not a description of how Joseph translated with the stone, or what he told people. It's really a description of how Oliver Cowdery could translate if he had known.
So you're saying that the apologists are inappropriately applying that method to Joseph as a way to get around the fact that there were things that happened that were completely inconsistent with the story that Joseph was telling about the words appearing in the stone. And the examples of that are misspellings and key conceptual changes that were subsequently made to the text of the Book of Mormon.
I have an anecdote that can maybe shed some light on this. So I have heard the argument that D&C 10 is about translating with a rod, but I'm not entirely convinced. And here's why. I was raised Pentecostal, and part of being Pentecostal is you're supposed to speak in tongues. And so there was a meeting that I went to when I was a young man, and they basically told me that when you speak in tongues, you feel the words coming up, within you, and then the Lord takes over your tongue, and you just sort of automatically speak these words, and you're not doing anything. Well, I couldn't speak in tongues under those premises, and so after about an hour of this prayer meeting, people laying hands on me and praying over me and everything, somebody tells me a different story. Somebody says that the real miracle, what happens is you babble, and then the Lord fills your words with meaning, and that's the real miracle, is the Lord fills your words with meaning. And so I was told two very contradictory and incompatible versions of how tongues works. And the second version was only told to me after I had failed under the first version. And it was under the second version that I actually managed to perform this. And then after much practice, it started to feel more like the first version. So I think that possibly what's happening here is that Joseph is just kind of changing his story after all of her fails under sort of the original premises.
Yeah, there's an element of automaticity with all this stuff, that the rod, they're sincere believers in the rod aren't moving it themselves, but it feels like it moves themselves. And it's called the ideomotor reflex. It's the part of the brain, one part of the brain works and the other part doesn't know that that other part is working. And it works with tongues the same way. The first description that Chris gave, where the language seems to be given or the tongues seems to come from another place. It's actually you, but it feels to the practitioner that they have no control. It's like hypnotism, where you can be hypnotized and
people will feel
make your arm
dissociation
rise.
of some
Your arm, yeah, it's part of dissociation.
It's also sort of like when you're driving on the highway and you're not paying attention to driving at all, and you drive somewhere completely different than you intended to go. It's like you've got this sort of unconscious part of your brain that is segmented off, and you're thinking about something else with the conscious part of your brain, but the unconscious part of your brain is doing all of the driving and navigation for you. And you don't have to think about it, but if you were a religious person, you might convince yourself that some sort of spiritual thing was going on, and that the Lord had guided you to this location that you drove to by accident, right? But no, it's just the way that the mind works.
This is one of those things that you start to realize how natural phenomena that are part of the human condition, that are manifest in things like what you just described and hypnotism, can be capitalized on by people who are trying to find a lever to control other people. And so, like when I was going through medical school and we started learning about the mechanics of sleep, and you learn about the kind of biologic foundation of sleep paralysis, and yet the experience of sleep paralysis is given a religious narrative that people then use to explain the world around them. And so you can have people, I think the existence of magicians and con men and people who deceive, that take these universal experiences and then claim a control over them that gives them a focus of power, is when I look back on what Joseph is doing that in this time, he's in some cases using people's willingness and desire to believe in some of these supernatural things, realizing that there's a captive audience that he can then tap into, and that's where you start to see him attaching on to people who are particularly susceptible to that level of belief, such as Martin Harris. And so now we have this partnership between Martin Harris and Joseph Smith. They've got a certain amount of text produced. Where does the stone go from this point? It's now been used in the translation of the Book of Mormon. What happens to it? Are we seeing distinct phases where it's only used for translation, or at what point does Joseph start to say, not only is he seeing, in the past he's seen the location of treasure, he's also seeing translation of words, but now he's getting direct communication from God that is so direct that when he writes it down, it's in the first person voice of the Lord. When do those messages start coming through the stone? If either of you have an idea.
Okay. Well, it's very precise time. It's the loss of the 116 pages.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, the loss of the 116 pages changes everything. He's in this crisis, and then he starts getting a revelation about what he should do next.
So it's that. Now, I guess he's at this point, the story of the first vision has not come public. So he's not had any other public
Right.
disclosure of being directly addressed by deity. Is that correct? Until that happens?
Well, it's the first revelation that we have recorded anyway, DNC 3, given to Martin Harris. Calls him a wicked man, and that's where it really takes off. Is the solution? What is he going to do now?
There are a couple accounts that say that when Joseph was given instructions about how to get the plates, that it was the Spirit of the Almighty that came to him and told him that. So there were sort of a few different versions of who appeared to him, Moroni as opposed to the Spirit of the Almighty. So there's kind of some maybe conflation or overlap going on in the way that he's describing those, sort of reframing the Moroni experience as a revelation, a direct revelation from God.
Okay.
Another interesting thing, just as a side note, is that his very first Doctrine and Covenants-ish revelation is not in the first person, it's in the third person. And it's only in his second revelation that he sort of discovers that first person voice of God.
And that third person voice of God ends up serving him in convenient ways, I think, when we get to the Nauvoo period. By then, he's, I think, abandoned the use of the stone to be able to receive that narrative, but there's a famous story where, when they're looking to find someone to replace John C. Bennett, it has a revelation in the middle of the meeting that they're having there, and he tosses the paper with the revelation over to somebody, essentially silencing them. But I think that's a remarkable event, though, that when you look back, we now have the stone being the conduit for direct communication from God, rather than just a tool of translation. That almost seems like an impersonal thing if it's being used as a tool of translation, but when it's being used as the spiritual cell phone or whatever, it takes on a whole new level of meaning. Are there any other interesting events of Joseph receiving revelation through the stone?
Well, some of the revelations do come through the stone that we know of. Like, I think it's DNC 19, no, not 19, the one given to Orson Pratt anyway. And Orson Pratt remembers when he appears there in Fayette because of his brother Parley P. Pratt, and Joseph puts the stone in the hat and gets a revelation for him. It's not 19.
Okay.
I forget which one it was, but the number, but like 30 something. But so that's a direct thing. But we assume that a lot of those did come through the stone, just like.
One that really comes to my mind that, to me, is one of these proofs that what's going on is not exactly what Joseph is putting it, and that is the revelation that directed people to go up to Canada to get a copyright and sell it of the Book of Mormon. And we know from the document, I think it's David Whitmer's later address to all believers in Christ, where he gives this account. He says Joseph received this revelation through the stone, so he's indicating that this is not something that came other than through the stone. And it directed some particular individuals to go up and do that, and when they failed, they inquired as to Joseph, why did this fail? The Lord told us that it was going to work, and what do we know about the response that they got? Do you know about this one, Chris?
Yes. Joseph tells them that some revelations are, he looks in the stone and gets another revelation, and this revelation tells him some revelations are from God, some are from man, and some are from the devil.
So what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting rationalization, and it's something that he never says anything like this again. You know, and David Whitmer really seizes on it to say that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet in the later period. And Joseph gives up the stone fairly quickly, and David Whitmer concludes that this is sort of the moment that Joseph goes off the rails. When he starts receiving revelation that isn't through the stone, all of a sudden, the people who were more saturated with the treasure, or the magic worldview and everything that Joseph Smith initially came out of, all of a sudden they're starting to raise their eyebrows and wonder whether what they believed in is changing too much, whether perhaps Joseph is departing from the instruments that he's been given to do the work.
Yeah, this particular event, as I learned about it, affected me in terms of, if the prophet of God acting in his capacity as prophet cannot discern the difference between the voice of the devil and the voice of God giving him a direct commandment, then we've got a serious problem. I think the apologists will go back and they'll say, well, he didn't say specifically that the revelation was from the devil, but so you could assume it was a revelation from man. But even then, it presents its own problem, because if the prophet of God can't tell the difference between his own voice and God's voice, particularly when he's speaking in the first person, then it really destroys the credibility of it. And so in the tapestry of Mormon history and the accounts of Joseph Smith, there are certain big gaps, and that is a pretty big one. And so that's why I thought it was significant that that revelation is now published and publicly available on the Joseph Smith Papers website, whereas previously I don't think we had an official source of it other than that account from David Whitmer.
Well, and it's an important revelation too, because Hiram Page had sort of given a version of this story in which he says that Joseph Smith gathered these guys to send them to Canada to sell the copyright for $8,000 and told them to keep it secret from Martin Harris, because Martin Harris was a wicked man and wasn't supposed to get any of the profit for the Book of Mormon, and that the proceeds had been designated entirely for the benefit of the Smith family. Well, now we have this Canadian copyright revelation published through the Joseph Smith Papers, and so we can look and see what the revelation actually says. And it does promise Joseph Smith temporal blessings. It says essentially that these guys are going to Canada to sort of bring home temporal blessings for Joseph. But it also promises temporal blessings to the guys who are going to Canada. And a number of these guys are Book of Mormon witnesses. And so one of the things that this revelation reveals that's pretty interesting is that these guys had a financial stake in the Book of Mormon. They were expecting to profit from their involvement in all of this, everything that they were doing for Joseph. And so it raises some questions a little bit about their credibility when they offer their witness and their testimony.
That's actually a point that South Park people made very well. Anytime in their depiction of these early activities, it's very clear that there's a motive for Joseph in doing what he's doing. They have all the villagers say, well, why would he do that? Why would he claim these different things? And a lot of the analysis that's being done right now about this seer-stone kind of leaves out the motive component of it. When Bushman says we don't know why Joseph would do these particular things, well, when you look at the motivation, he had something that he stood to gain, and what you're describing is that some of the people around him also had some motivations, and so that anytime there are motivations like that, it just kind of increases the need that you have to look at it with a little bit of a skeptical eye, because people with these motivations are bound to do deceitful things.
Well, let me just say a couple more words about that, because it's also interesting. In some of the revelations, the early 1829 revelations, Joseph Smith is doing a little bit of manipulation to get the witnesses to testify, and to testify in just the way that he wants them to testify. So in D&C 5, which is a March 1829 revelation, the witnesses are explicitly commanded to say no more than that they have seen the things and know of surety that they are true, and they have been shown to me by the power of God. So this raises the interesting question of what more was Joseph maybe afraid that the witnesses would say about their experience. And of course, one of the things that the witnesses say is that they saw through their spiritual eyes. You know, there could be any number of other kind of manipulations that Joseph performed in order to get them to testify, and they would be, under this revelation, they would be forbidden from revealing those things.
This is
There's
another
another
important, just as an interject in there, you're bringing up another important part of folk magic tradition, which is this concept of second sight. Grant Palmer talks a little bit about this, but these people come from a background where people believed in second sight, where you could see things and have the experience be felt as tangible as with your primary eyes, even though they don't meet our current standards for that. And I think looking back with the knowledge that there's a tradition of that gives you a different perspective on how these people might have been using language to describe what they experienced. And the whole statement that you saw something by the gift and power of God, it seems to elevate the experience. And so as believers we say, well, that's really phenomenal, but we really should be expecting them to see them with their own physical eyes without the need of the gift and power of God if they were tangibly real.
Yeah, well, there's another revelation that I want to talk about here too, which is D&C 17, in which Oliver Cowdery is promised that he's going to be one of the witnesses. He's going to see the Nephite artifacts, and he's told, "It is by your faith that you shall obtain a view of them, and after that you have obtained faith and have seen with your eyes, you shall testify of them by the power of God, and this you shall do, that my servant Joseph Smith Jr. may not be destroyed." And ye shall testify that ye have seen them, even as my servant Joseph Smith Jr. has seen them, for it is by my power that he has seen them, and it is because he had faith. So essentially, Oliver, there's a couple things going on here. One, Oliver is told to have faith, and then it's by his faith that he'll obtain a view of them. So this, first of all, it's kind of putting him in the right state of mind to have a spiritual experience. And secondly, it's setting up a potential explanation in case Oliver doesn't manage to see the Nephite artifacts. This would explain why he failed, right? Joseph could say, well, you just didn't have enough faith. Another thing that it does, though, is it really appeals to Oliver's sense of duty to testify, because if he doesn't testify, Joseph Smith will be destroyed. And this is kind of a manipulation that Joseph uses later with polygamy, right? He's always telling these women, well, an angel with a flaming sword said he'd kill me if I don't marry you. And so, again, kind of appealing to their sense of duty to protect him and to save his life. So these are, I mean, it's an interesting pattern that he falls into.
So I'm hearing you say that...
One thing about...
Go ahead, Dan.
About Cowdery, he had already had a vision of the plates before he even met Joseph Smith.
Really? Tell us about that.
Well, the 1832 account that was never published during Joseph Smith's lifetime is pretty revealing in various different ways. But one way, it's towards the end of it, before it cuts off abruptly, is that it says that Cowdery came to him on account of having a vision of the Lord who showed him the plates.
Really?
So there were already three witnesses when Joseph Smith is dictating in the Book of Mormon. There's two references in Nephi and in the Book of Ether mentions three witnesses. There were already three. One was himself, Oliver Cowdery, and Mary Musselman Whitmer, who had seen the plates when she went out to milk the cows. An angel appeared and showed her the plates.
That's fascinating, because when you read about the experiences people have with this concept of second sight, it also involves seeing people that no one else has witnessed to, and that may play somewhat into those types of accounts. As we look back on kind of what we've discussed, we've gone over the phases and different types of use of the stone that Joseph had, starting back with a very strong magic bent to what was being done for the purpose of treasure seeking, and we've seen it gradually morph over time. And I was hearing you say that it may have been this Canadian revelation, which was one of the key things that persuaded Joseph Smith to discard the stone itself. Before we get to that, though, there's another kind of chapter of discussion that I think is important to have, but I have to go. I'm reaching the end of my time. Is there a chance that we could have one more session, either tomorrow in the early afternoon or anything like that? Are either of you available? Because I think there's at least one more phase of things that are worth discussing, particularly when competing stones showed up and he had to somehow consolidate his authority, and then what ultimately happened to the stone after that.
I'm not available tomorrow.
Okay. Well, why don't we just do
or Monday. I am available Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Okay. Well, we may be able to do a follow-up, but we've kind of covered a pretty broad gamut of this stone as it's traced itself throughout the life of Joseph Smith near the beginning of the history of the church, and seen how it's been used in a number of different ways. If you had some closing thoughts on how this stone and Joseph's use of it specifically dealt with him consolidating power and maintaining control in the early church, or anything else, what do you have to say, Chris?
Well, I think that he used the stone because he was in a magic culture, and as soon as he gets out of the magic culture, the stone ceases to be a useful artifact. And so, he switches to a different method. So I think that this just shows that prophets sort of conform to cultural expectations. And when the cultural expectations change, so do the prophets.
All right, and that's a pattern that the church has established and does a good job doing over the years, is conforming to the culture and the demands of society. Dan, what do you, any closing thoughts?
Well, yeah, Joseph Smith was a product of his culture. He was, a blend of a biblical and a magical kind of prophet. But I would say that the best probably approach that apologists can take is not to deny all this, but to accept it, and then go with Joseph Smith being inspired like any mystic, prophet, or whatever, seer, whatever you want to call him, and just believe the inspiration or revelation of their scriptures without trying to change the history behind them.
So you can see Joseph Smith as an inspirational person in the context of a religious experience and tradition that doesn't exactly fit the one true church, one linear authority paradigm that we have, but allows people to still find meaning in what Joseph did.
Well, my argument is that Joseph Smith believed he was a prophet and that he was inspired, but that he used these to increase faith. So the worry now with apologists is that if you don't have these things, it will decrease faith. It's sort of like Joseph Smith's competing against other seers, but he's competing against other prophets like Jemima Wilkinson in Western New York. They get revelations, but they're all forgotten. If Joseph Smith had just dictated a revelation, he wouldn't have got many believers. But because he could produce plates, he could use these stones that people believed in. They believed him so much, like David Whitmer, that when Joseph Smith gave up the stone, David Whitmer says he no longer had the power. Yeah. So it decreased his faith in Joseph Smith without the stone, and that he was more liable to, mix his own thoughts in with the revelation. So he lost some of the early audience that way, but um, so it increased faith with them, and it still continues to increase faith over other prophets' revelations, these material things. It's these material things that makes them more vulnerable, though, in the historical analysis, because he's externalized this religion, and that's always when the psychic runs into trouble, when it ceases to be just a mental process, when they try to produce actual bending of the spoons and things like that, that they can be tested and they run into trouble usually. So now we want to roll that back and just stick with the revelation, forget about the trappings, and it will be harder to convince people of the revelation, when you try to convert people out there, but it's still probably more accurate to do that.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Chris and Dan both for participating in the discussion. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you guys bringing your perspective to, the conversations that are happening right now. For me, as I look at the history, I think, it's been said that if you study church history, you'll gain in your testimony and faith of Joseph Smith. And while as I learn more about him, I'm less convinced of his claims to divine authority. I'm absolutely more convinced of his remarkable gifts as somebody who can create just a very captivating story and mythology around the religion that he's created. And as you see him in his Nauvoo years, when he starts to not only do that, but also engage in all these different management issues with being, in charge of the Nauvoo Legion, mayor, as well as the prophet and president, all these other things. He's just a phenomenal character that is a joy to learn about, with all the wrinkles and everything. He's a very captivating person in history. So with that, till the next time, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Take care.